This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain, Chapter 15, Tom as King. The next day the foreign ambassadors came with their gorgeous trains, and Tom, throned in awful state, received them. The splendors of the scene delighted his eye and fired his imagination, at first, but the audience was long and dreary, and so were most of the addresses; wherefore what began as a pleasure grew into weariness and homesickness by and by. Tom said the words which Hartford put into his mouth from time to time, and tried hard to acquit himself satisfactorily; but he was too new to such things, and too ill at ease to accomplish more than a tolerable success. He looked sufficiently like a king, but he was ill able to feel like one. He was cordially glad when the ceremony was ended. The larger part of his day was wasted, as he termed it in his own mind, in labors pertaining to his royal office. Even the 2 hours devoted to certain princely pastimes and recreations were rather a burden to him than otherwise, they were so fettered by restrictions and ceremonious observances. However, he had a private hour with his whipping-boy, which he counted clear gain, since he got both entertainment and needful information out of it. The third day of Tom Canty's kingship came and went much as the others had done, but there was a lifting of his cloud in one way: he felt less uncomfortable than at first. He was getting a little used to his circumstances and surroundings. His change still galled, but not all the time. He found that the presence and homage of the great afflicted and embarrassed him less and less sharply with every hour that drifted over his head. But for one single dread, he could have seen the fourth day approach without serious distress: the dining in public. It was to begin that day. There were greater matters in the program, for on that day he would have to preside at a council which would take his views and commands concerning the policy to be pursued toward various foreign nations scattered far and near over the great globe. On that day, too, Hartford would be formally chosen to the grand office of Lord Protector. Other things of note were appointed for that fourth day also, but to Tom they were all insignificant compared with the ordeal of dining all by himself, with a multitude of curious eyes fastened upon him, and a multitude of mouths whispering comments upon his performance, and upon his mistakes if he should be so unlucky as to make any. Still, nothing could stop that fourth day, and so it came. It found poor Tom low-spirited and absent-minded, and this mood continued. He could not shake it off. The ordinary duties of the morning dragged upon his hands and wearied him. Once more he felt the sense of captivity heavy upon him. Late in the forenoon he was in a large audience-chamber conversing with the Earl of Hertford, and dully awaiting the striking of the hour appointed for a visit of ceremony from a considerable number of great officials and courtiers. After a little while Tom, who had wandered to a window and become interested in the life and movement of the great highway beyond the palace gates, and not idly interested, but longing with all his heart to take part in person in its stir and freedom, saw the van of a hooting and shouting mob of disorderly men, women, and children of the lowest and poorest degree approaching from up the road. "I would I knew what 'tis about," he exclaimed, with all a boy's curiosity in such happenings. "Thou art king," solemnly responded the Earl with a reverence. "Have I your Grace's leave to act?" "Oh, blithely yes, oh, gladly yes!" exclaimed Tom excitedly, adding to himself, with a lively sense of satisfaction, "In truth, being a king is not all dreariness; it hath its compensations and conveniences." The Earl called a page, and sent him to the captain of the guard with the order: "Let the mob be halted, and inquiry made concerning the occasion of its movement, by the King's command." A few seconds later a long rank of the royal guards, cased in flashing steel, filed out at the gates and formed across the highway in front of the multitude. A messenger returned to report that the crowd were following a man, a woman, and a young girl to execution for crimes committed against the peace and dignity of the realm. Death, and a violent death, for these poor unfortunates. The thought wrung Tom's heartstrings. The spirit of compassion took control of him, to the exclusion of all other considerations. He never thought of the offended laws, or of the grief or loss which these three criminals had inflicted upon their victims. He could think of nothing but the scaffold and the grisly fate hanging over the heads of the condemned. His concern even made him forget for the moment that he was but the false shadow of a king, not the substance, and before he knew it he had blurted out the command, "Bring them here!" Then he flushed scarlet, and a sort of apology sprung to his lips; but observing that his order had wrought no sort of a surprise in the Earl or the waiting page, he suppressed the words he was about to utter. The page, in the most matter-of-course way, made a profound obeisance, and retired backwards out of the room to deliver the command. Tom experienced a glow of pride and a renewed sense of the compensating advantages of the kingly office. He said to himself, "Truly it is like what I was used to feel when I read the old priest's tales, and did imagine mine own self a prince, giving law and command to all, saying do this, do that, whilst none durst offer let or hindrance to my will." Now the doors swung open, one high-sounding title after another was announced, the personages owning them followed, and the place was quickly half filled with noble folk and finery. But Tom was hardly conscious of the presence of these people, so wrought up was he, and so intensely absorbed in that other and more interesting matter. He seated himself absently in his chair of state, and turned his eyes upon the door with manifestations of impatient expectancy; seeing which, the company forbore to trouble him, and fell to chatting a mixture of public business and court gossip one with another. In a little while the measured tread of military men was heard approaching, and the culprits entered the presence in charge of an under-sheriff and escorted by a detail of the King's Guard. The civil officer knelt before Tom, then stood aside. The three doomed persons knelt also, and remained so. The guard took position behind Tom's chair. Tom scanned the prisoners curiously. Something about the dress or appearance of the man had stirred a vague memory in him. "Methinks I have seen this man ere now, but the when or the where fail me." Such was Tom's thought. Just then the man glanced meekly up, and quickly dropped his face again, not being able to endure the awful port of sovereignty. But the one full glimpse of the face which Tom got was sufficient. He said to himself, "Now is the matter clear. This is the stranger that plucked Gil's wit out of the Thames and saved his life, that windy bitter first day of the new year. A brave good deed. Pity he hath been doing baser ones, and got himself in this sad case. I have not forgot the day, neither the hour, by reason that an hour after, upon the stroke of 11, I did get a hiding by the hand of Gammer Ganty, which is of so goodly and admired severity that all that went before or followed after it were but fondlings and caress by comparison." Tom now ordered that the woman and the girl be removed from the presence for a little time, then addressed himself to the under-sheriff, saying, "Good sir, what is this man's offence?" The officer knelt, and answered, "So please your majesty, he hath taken the life of a subject by poison." Tom's compassion for the prisoner, and admiration of him as the daring rescuer of a drowning boy, experienced a most damaging shock. "The thing was proven upon him?" he asked. "Most clearly, sire." Tom sighed, and said, "Take him away. He hath earned his death. 'Tis a pity, for he was a brave heart. I mean he hath the look of it." The prisoner clasped his hands together with sudden energy, and wrung them despairingly, at the same time appealing imploringly to the King in broken and terrified phrases. "O my lord the King, and thou canst pity the lost, have pity upon me. I am innocent, neither hath that wherewith I am charged been more than but lamely proved. Yet I speak not of that. The judgment is gone forth against me, and may not suffer alteration. Yet in mine extremity I beg a boon, for my doom is more than I can bear. A grace, my lord the King, in thy royal compassion grant me my prayer. Give commandment that I be hanged." Tom was amazed. This was not the outcome he had looked for. "Odds my life, a strange boon! Was it not the fate intended thee?" "Oh, good my liege, not so. It is ordered that I be boiled alive." The hideous surprise of these words almost made Tom spring from his chair. As soon as he could recover his wits, he cried out, "Have thy wish, poor soul! An thou had poisoned 100 men, thou shouldst not suffer so miserable a death." The prisoner bowed his face to the ground, and burst into passionate expressions of gratitude, ending with, "If ever thou shouldst know misfortune, which God forfend, may thy goodness to me this day be remembered and requited." Tom turned to the Earl of Hertford and said, "My lord, is it believable that there was warrant for this man's ferocious doom?" "It is the law, your grace, for poisoners. In Germany coiners be boiled to death in oil, not cast in of a sudden, but by a rope let down into the oil by degrees, and slowly; first the feet, then the legs, then—" "Oh, prithee no more, my lord, I cannot bear it!" cried Tom, covering his eyes with his hands to shut out the picture. "I beseech your good lordship that order be taken to change this law. Oh, let no more poor creatures be visited with its tortures." The Earl's face showed profound gratification, for he was a man of merciful and generous impulses, a thing not very common with his class in that fierce age. He said "These your grace's noble words have sealed its doom. History will remember it to the honour of your royal house." The under sheriff was about to remove his prisoner. Tom gave him a sign to wait, and then he said "Good sir, I would look into this matter further. The man has said his deed was but lamely proved. Tell me what thou knowest."
"If the King's grace please, it did appear upon the trial that this man entered into a house in the hamlet of Islington, where one lay sick. 3 witnesses say it was at 10 of the clock in the morning, and 2 say it was some minutes later, the sick man being alone at the time and sleeping. And presently the man came forth again, and went his way. The sick man died within the hour, being torn with spasms and retchings."
"Did any see the poison given? Was poison found?"
"Marry, no, my liege."
"Then how doth one know there was poison given at all?"
"Please your majesty, the doctors testified that none die with such symptoms but by poison."
Weighty evidence this, in that simple age. Tom recognised its formidable nature, and said "The doctor knoweth his trade. Belike they were right. The matter hath an ill look for this poor man."
"Yet was not this all, your majesty. There is more and worse. Many testified that a witch, since gone from the village, none know whither, did foretell, and speak it privately in their ears, that the sick man would die by poison; and more, that a stranger would give it, a stranger with brown hair, and clothed in a worn and common garb. And surely this prisoner doth answer woundily to the bill, please your majesty to give this circumstance that solemn weight which is its due, seeing it was foretold."
This was an argument of tremendous force, in that superstitious day. Tom felt that the thing was settled. If evidence was worth anything, this poor fellow's guilt was proved. Still he offered the prisoner a chance, saying "If thou canst say aught in thyself, speak."
"Naught that will avail, my king. I am innocent, yet cannot I make it appear. I have no friends, else might I show that I was not in Islington that day. So also might I show that at that hour they name I was above a league away, seeing I was at Wapping Old Stairs. Yea, more, my king, for I could show that whilst they say I was taking life, I was saving it, a drowning boy. Peace! Sheriff, name the day the deed was done." "At 10 in the morning, or some minutes later, the first day of the new year, most illustrious—"
"Let the prisoner go free. It's the King's will." Another blush followed this unregal outburst, and he covered his indecorum as well as he could by adding "It enrageth me that a man should be hanged upon such idle, hair brained evidence." A low buzz of admiration swept through the assemblage. It was not admiration of the decree that had been delivered by Tom, for the propriety or expediency of pardoning a convicted poisoner was a thing which few there would have felt justified in either admitting or admiring. No, the admiration was for the intelligence and spirit which Tom had displayed. Some of the low voiced remarks were to this effect "This is no mad king. He hath his wits sound."
"How sanely he puts his questions! How like his former natural self was this abrupt imperious disposal of the matter!"
"God be thanked, his infirmity is spent. This is no weakling, but a king. He hath borne himself like to his own father." The air being filled with applause, Tom's ear necessarily caught a little of it. The effect which this had upon him was to put him greatly at his ease, and also to charge his system with very gratifying sensations. However, his juvenile curiosity soon rose superior to these pleasant thoughts and feelings. He was eager to know what sort of a deadly mischief the woman and the little girl could have been about. So by his command the 2 terrified and sobbing creatures were brought before him. "What is it that these have done?" he inquired of the sheriff.
"Please your majesty, a black crime is charged upon them, and clearly proven, wherefore the judges have decreed, according to the law, that they be hanged. They sold themselves to the devil, such is their crime." Tom shuddered. He had been taught to abhor people who did this wicked thing. Still, he was not going to deny himself the pleasure of feeding his curiosity, for all that, so he asked, "Where was this done, and when?" "On a midnight in December, in a ruined church, your majesty." Tom shuddered again. "Who was there present?" "Only these two, your grace, and that other." "Have these confessed?" "Nay, not so, sire, they do deny it." "Then prithee how was it known?" "Certain witnesses did see them wending thither, good your majesty. This bred the suspicion, and dire effects have since confirmed and justified it. In particular, it is in evidence that through the wicked power so obtained, they did invoke and bring about a storm that wasted all the region round about. Above 40 witnesses have proved the storm, and sooth one might have had 1,000, for all had reason to remember it, sith all had suffered by it." "Certes, this is serious matter." Tom turned this dark piece of scoundrelism over in his mind a while, and then asked, "Suffered the woman also by the storm?" Several old heads among the assemblage nodded their recognition of the wisdom of this question. The sheriff, however, saw nothing consequential in the inquiry. He answered with simple directness, "Indeed did she, your majesty, and most righteously, as all aver. Her habitation was swept away, and herself and child left shelterless." "Methinks the power to do herself so ill a turn was dearly bought. She had been cheated, had she paid but a farthing for it. That she paid her soul and her child's argueth that she is mad. If she is mad, she knoweth not what she doth, therefore sinneth not." The elderly heads nodded recognition of Tom's wisdom once more, and one individual murmured, "And the king be mad himself, according to report, then it is a madness of a sort that would improve the sanity of some I wot of, if by the gentle providence of God they could but catch it." "What age hath the child?" asked Tom. 9 years, please your majesty." "By the law of England may a child enter into covenant and sell itself, my lord?" asked Tom, turning to a learned judge.
"The law doth not permit a child to make or meddle in any weighty matter, good my liege, holding that its callow wit unfitteth it to cope with the riper wit and evil schemings of them that are its elders. The devil may buy a child, if he so choose, and the child agree thereto, but not an Englishman. In this latter case the contract would be null and void." "It seemeth a rude unchristian thing, and ill contrived, that English law denieth privileges to Englishmen to waste them on the devil," cried Tom with honest heat. This novel view of the matter excited many smiles, and was stored away in many heads to be repeated about the court as evidence of Tom's originality as well as progress toward mental health. The elder culprit had ceased from sobbing, and was hanging upon Tom's words with an excited interest and a growing hope. Tom noticed this, and it strongly inclined his sympathies toward her in her perilous and unfriended situation. Presently he asked, "How wrought they to bring the storm?" "By pulling off their stockings, sire." This astonished Tom, and also fired his curiosity to fever heat. He said eagerly, "It is wonderful. Hath it always this dread effect?" "Always, my liege, at least if the woman doth desire it, and utter the needful words, either in her mind or with her tongue." Tom turned to the woman, and said with impetuous zeal, "Exert thy power, I would see a storm." There was a sudden paling of cheeks in the superstitious assemblage, and a general, though unexpressed, desire to get out of the place, all of which was lost upon Tom, who was dead to everything but the proposed cataclysm. Seeing a puzzled and astonished look in the woman's face, he added excitedly, "Never fear, thou shalt be blameless. More, thou shalt go free, none shall touch thee. Exert thy power." "O my lord the king, I have it not. I have been falsely accused." "Thy fears stay thee. Be of good heart, thou shalt suffer no harm. Make a storm, it mattereth not how small a one. I require naught great or harmful, but indeed prefer the opposite. Do this, and thy life is spared. Thou shalt go out free, with thy child, bearing the king's pardon, and safe from hurt or malice from any in the realm." The woman prostrated herself, and protested with tears that she had no power to do the miracle, else she would gladly win her child's life alone, and be content to lose her own, if by obedience to the King's command so precious a grace might be acquired. Tom urged. The woman still adhered to her declarations. Finally he said, "I think the woman hath said true. An my mother were in her place, and gifted with the devil's functions, she had not stayed a moment to call her storms and lay the whole land in ruins, if the saving of my forfeit life were the price she got. It is argument that other mothers are made in like mould. Thou art free, good wife, thou and thy child, for I do think thee innocent. Now thou'st nought to fear, being pardoned. Pull off thy stockings, and thou canst make me a storm. Thou shalt be rich." The redeemed creature was loud in her gratitude, and proceeded to obey, whilst Tom looked on with eager expectancy, a little marred by apprehension, the courtiers at the same time manifesting decided discomfort and uneasiness. The woman stripped her own feet and her little girl's also, and plainly did her best to reward the King's generosity with an earthquake, but it was all a failure and a disappointment. Tom sighed, and said, "There, good soul, trouble thyself no further. Thy power is departed out of thee. Go thy way in peace, and if it return to thee at any time, forget me not, but fetch me a storm." [Footnote: Character of Hertford. The young King discovered an extreme attachment to his uncle, who was, in the main, a man of moderation and probity. Hume's History of England, Vol. 3, page 324. But if he, the Protector, gave offence by assuming too much state, he deserves great praise on account of the laws passed this session, by which the rigour of former statutes was much mitigated, and some security given to the freedom of the Constitution. All laws were repealed which extended the crime of treason beyond the statute of the 25th of Edward III. All laws enacted during the late reign extending the crime of felony. All the former laws against Lollardy or heresy, together with the statute of the 6 Articles. None were to be accused for words, but within a month after they were spoken. By these repeals several of the most rigorous laws that ever passed in England were annulled, and some dawn, both of civil and religious liberty, began to appear to the people. A repeal also passed of that law, the destruction of all laws, by which the King's proclamation was made of equal force with the statute. Ibid, Vol. 3, page 339. End of chapter 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain. Chapter 16. The State Dinner. The dinner hour drew near, yet strangely enough the thought brought but slight discomfort to Tom, and hardly any terror. The morning's experiences had wonderfully built up his confidence. The poor little ash cat was already more wonted to his strange garret after 4 days' habit than a mature person could have become in a full month. A child's facility in accommodating itself to circumstances was never more strikingly illustrated. Let us privileged ones hurry to the great banqueting room and have a glance at matters there whilst Tom is being made ready for the imposing occasion. It is a spacious apartment, with gilded pillars and pilasters, and pictured walls and ceilings. At the door stand tall guards, as rigid as statues, dressed in rich and picturesque costumes, and bearing halberds. In a high gallery which runs all around the place is a band of musicians and a packed company of citizens of both sexes, in brilliant attire. In the centre of the room, upon a raised platform, is Tom's table. Now let the ancient chronicler speak. "A gentleman enters the room bearing a rod, and along with him another bearing a tablecloth, which, after they have both kneeled 3 times with the utmost veneration, he spreads upon the table, and after kneeling again they both retire. They come 2 others, one with the rod again, the other with a salt cellar, a plate, and bread. When they have kneeled, as the others had done, and placed what was brought upon the table, they too retire with the same ceremonies performed by the first. At last come two nobles, richly clothed, one bearing a tasting knife, who, after prostrating themselves 3 times in the most graceful manner, approach and rub the table with bread and salt with as much awe as if the king had been present. [Footnote: Leigh Hunt's The Town, page 408, quotation from an early tourist.] End of footnote. So end the solemn preliminaries. Now, far down the echoing corridors, we hear a bugle blast, and the indistinct cry, "Place for the King! Way for the King's most excellent Majesty!" These sounds are momently repeated, they grow nearer and nearer, and presently, almost in our faces, the martial note peals, and the cry rings out, "Way for the King!" At this instant the shining pageant appears, and files in at the door, with a measured march. Let the chronicler speak again. "First come gentlemen, barons, earls, knights of the Garter, all richly dressed and bareheaded. Next comes the chancellor, between two, one of which carries the royal scepter, the other the sword of state in a red scabbard, studded with golden fleur de lis, the point upwards. Next comes the King himself, whom, upon his appearing, 12 trumpets and many drums salute with a great burst of welcome, whilst all in the galleries rise in their places, crying, 'God save the King!' After him come nobles attached to his person, and on his right and left march his guard of honor, his 50 gentlemen pensioners, with gilt battle axes." This was all fine and pleasant. Tom's pulse beat high, and a glad light was in his eye. He bore himself right gracefully, and all the more so because he was not thinking of how he was doing it, his mind being charmed and occupied with the blithe sights and sounds about him. And besides, nobody can be very ungraceful in nicely fitting beautiful clothes after he has grown a little used to them, especially if he is for the moment unconscious of them. Tom remembered his instructions, and acknowledged his greeting with a slight inclination of his plumed head and a courteous, "I thank ye, my good people." He seated himself at table, without removing his cap, and did it without the least embarrassment, for to eat with one's cap on was the one solitary royal custom upon which the kings and the Cantys met as upon common ground, neither party having any advantage over the other in the matter of old familiarity with it. The pageant broke up and grouped itself picturesquely, and remained bareheaded. Now, to the sound of gay music, the yeomen of the guard entered. "The tallest and mightiest men in England, they being carefully selected in this regard." But we will let the chronicler tell about it. "The yeomen of the guard entered, bareheaded, clothed in scarlet, with golden roses upon their backs, and these went and came, bringing in each turn a course of dishes, served in plate. These dishes were received by a gentleman in the same order they were brought, and placed upon the table, while the taster gave to each guard a mouthful to eat of the particular dish he had brought, for fear of any poison. Tom made a good dinner, notwithstanding he was conscious that hundreds of eyes followed each morsel to his mouth and watched him eat it with an interest which could not have been more intense if it had been a deadly explosive, and was expected to blow him up and scatter him all about the place. He was careful not to hurry, and equally careful not to do anything whatever for himself, but wait till the proper official knelt down and did it for him. He got through without a mistake, a flawless and precious triumph. When the meal was over at last, and he marched away in the midst of his bright pageant, with the happy noises in his ears of blaring bugles, rolling drums, and thundering acclamations, he felt that if he had seen the worst of dining in public, it was an ordeal which he would be glad to endure several times a day, if by that means he could but buy himself free from some of the more formidable requirements of his royal office. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. Foo-Foo the First. Miles Hendon hurried along toward the Southwark end of the bridge, keeping a sharp lookout for the persons he sought, and hoping and expecting to overtake them presently. He was disappointed in this, however. By asking questions he was enabled to track them part of the way through Southwark, then all traces ceased, and he was perplexed as to how to proceed. Still, he continued his efforts as best he could during the rest of the day. Nightfall found him leg-weary, half-famished, and his desire as far from accomplishment as ever. So he supped at the Tabard Inn, and went to bed, resolved to make an early start in the morning and give the town an exhaustive search. As he lay thinking and planning, he presently began to reason thus: the boy would escape from the ruffian, his reputed father, if possible. Would he go back to London and seek his former haunts? No, he would not do that; he would avoid recapture. What, then, would he do? Never having had a friend in the world, or a protector, until he met Miles Hendon, he would naturally try to find that friend again, provided the effort did not require him to go toward London and danger. He would strike for Hendon Hall, that is what he would do, for he knew Hendon was homeward bound, and there he might expect to find him. Yes, the case was plain to Hendon. He must lose no more time in Southwark, but move at once through Ghent toward Monk's home, searching the wood and inquiring as he went. Let us return to the vanished little King now. The ruffian whom the waiter at the inn on the bridge saw about to join the youth and the King, did not exactly join them, but fell in close behind them and followed their steps. He said nothing. His left arm was in a sling, and he wore a large green patch over his left eye. He limped slightly, and used an oaken staff as a support. The youth led the King a crooked course through Southwark, and by struck into high road beyond. The King was irritated now, and said he would stop here; it was Hendon's place to come to him, not his to go to Hendon. He would not endure such insolence. He would stop where he was. The youth said, "Thou'lt tarry here, and thy friend lying wounded in the wood yonder? So be it, then." The King's manner changed at once, and he cried out, "Wounded? And who hath dared to do it? But that is apart. Lead on, faster, sirrah. Art shod with lead? Wounded is he? Now, though the doer of it be a duke's son, he shall rue it." It was some distance to the wood, but the space was speedily traversed. The youth looked about him, discovered a bow sticking in the ground, with a small bit of rag tied to it, then led the way into the forest, watching for similar bows, and finding them at intervals. They were evidently guides to the point he was aiming at. By and by an open place was reached, where were the charred remains of a farmhouse, and near them a barn which was falling to ruin and decay. There was no sign of life anywhere, and utter silence prevailed. The youth entered the barn, the King following eagerly upon his heels. No one there. The King shot a surprised and suspicious glance at the youth, and asked, "Where is he?" A mocking laugh was his answer. The King was in a rage in a moment. He seized a billet of wood and was in the act of charging upon the youth when another mocking laugh fell upon his ear. It was from the lame ruffian, who had been following at a distance. The King turned and said angrily, "Who art thou? What is thy business here?" "Leave thy foolery," said the man, "and quiet thyself. My disguise is none so good that thou canst pretend thou knowest not thy father through it." "Thou art not my father. I know thee not. I am the King. If thou hast hid my servant, find him for me, or thou shalt sup sorrow for what thou hast done." John Canty replied, in a stern and measured voice, "It is plain thou art mad, and I am loath to punish thee; but if thou provoke me, I must. Thy prating doth no harm here where there are no ears that need to mind thy follies, yet is it well to practise thy tongue to wary speech, that it may do no hurt when our quarters change. I have done a murder, and may not tarry at home, neither shalt thou, seeing I need thy service. My name is changed, for wise reasons. It is Hobbs, John Hobbs. Thine is Jack. Charge thy memory accordingly. Now then, speak. Where is thy mother? Where are thy sisters? They came not to the place appointed. Knowest thou whither they went?" The King answered sullenly, "Trouble me not with these riddles. My mother is dead, my sisters are in the palace." The youth near by burst into a derisive laugh, and the King would have assaulted him, but Canty, or Hobbs, as he now called himself, prevented him and said, "Peace, Hugo, vex him not. His mind is astray, and thy ways fret him. Sit thee down, Jack, and quiet thyself. Thou shalt have a morsel to eat anon." Hobbs and Hugo fell to talking together in low voices, and the King removed himself as far as he could from their disagreeable company. He withdrew into the twilight of the farther end of the barn. When he found the earthen floor bedded a foot deep with straw, he lay down here, drew straw over himself in lieu of blankets, and was soon absorbed in thinkings. He had many griefs, but the minor ones were swept almost into forgetfulness by the supreme one, the loss of his father. To the rest of the world the name of Henry VIII brought a shiver, and suggested an ogre whose nostrils breathed destruction, and whose hand dealt scourgings and death. but to this boy the name brought only sensations of pleasure. The figure it invoked wore a countenance that was all gentleness and affection. He called to mind a long succession of loving passages between his father and himself, and dwelt fondly upon them, his unstinted tears attesting how deep and real was the grief that possessed his heart. As the afternoon wasted away, the lad, wearied with his troubles, sank gradually into a tranquil and healing slumber. After a considerable time, he could not tell how long, his senses struggled to a half consciousness, and as he lay with closed eyes, vaguely wondering where he was and what had been happening, he noted a murmurous sound, the sullen beating of rain upon the roof. A snug sense of comfort stole over him, which was rudely broken, the next moment, by a chorus of piping cackles and coarse laughter. It startled him disagreeably, and he unmuffled his head to see whence this interruption proceeded. A grim and unsightly picture met his eye. A bright fire was burning in the middle of the floor at the other end of the barn, and around it, and lit weirdly up by the red glare, lolled and sprawled the motliest company of tattered gutter scum and ruffians, of both sexes, he had ever read or dreamed of. There were huge, stalwart men, brown with exposure, long-haired, and clothed in fantastic rags. There were middle-sized youths, of truculent countenance, and similarly clad. There were blind mendicants with patched or bandaged eyes, crippled ones with wooden legs and crutches. There was a villain-looking peddler with his pack, a knife-grinder, a tinker, and a barber-surgeon with the implements of their trades. Some of the females were hardly grown girls, some were at prime, some were old and wrinkled hags, and all were loud, brazen, foul-mouthed, and all soiled and slatternly. There were 3 sore-faced babies, there were a couple of starveling curs with strings about their necks, whose office was to lead the blind. The night was come, the gang had just finished feasting, an orgy was beginning, the can of liquor was passing from mouth to mouth. A general cry broke forth, "A song! A song from the Bat and Dick Dot-and-Go One!" One of the blind men got up, and made ready by casting aside the patches that sheltered his excellent eyes, and the pathetic placard which recited the cause of his calamity. Dot-and-Go One disencumbered himself of his timber leg, and took his place upon sound and healthy limbs, beside his fellow rascal. Then they roared out a rollicking ditty, and were reinforced by the whole crew, at the end of each stanza, in a rousing chorus. By the time the last stanza was reached, the half-drunken enthusiasm had risen to such a pitch that everybody joined in and sang it clear through from the beginning, producing a volume of villainous sound that made the rafters quake. These were the inspiring words: "Bein' darkmans then, bows, mort, and ken, the bein' coves beings awast, on chaties to trine by Rome coves dine, for his long lib at last. Binged out bein' morts and tour, bing out of the Rome vile bine, and tour the cove that cloyed your duds, upon the chaties to trine." Footnote: From the English Rogue, London, 1665. End of footnote. Conversation followed, not in the thieves' dialect of the song, for that was only used in talk when unfriendly ears might be listening. In the course of it appeared that John Hobbs was not altogether a new recruit, but had trained in the gang at some former time. His later history was called for, and when he said he had "accidentally" killed a man, considerable satisfaction was expressed. When he added that the man was a priest, he was roundly applauded, and had to take a drink with everybody. Old acquaintances welcomed him joyously, and new ones were proud to shake him by the hand. He was asked why he had tarried away so many months. He answered, "London is better than the country, and safer these late years. The laws be so bitter and so diligently enforced, and I had not had that accident I had stayed there. I had resolved to stay and never more venture countrywards, but the accident has ended that." He inquired how many persons the gang numbered now. The ruffler, or chief, answered, 25 sturdy budges, bulks, files, clapperdogeons, and maunders, counting the dells and doxies and other morts. Footnote: Canting terms for various kinds of thieves, beggars, and vagabonds, and their female companions. End of footnote. "Most are here, the rest are wandering eastward along the Winterley. We follow at dawn." "I do not see the Wen among the honest folk about me. Where may he be?"
Poor lad, his diet is brimstone now, and over hot for a delicate taste. He was killed in a brawl, somewhere about midsummer." "I sorrow to hear that. The Wen was a capable man, and brave." "That was he, truly. Black Bess, his dell, is of us yet, but absent on the eastward tramp. A fine lass, of nice ways and orderly conduct, none ever seeing her drunk above 4 days in the 7. "She was ever strict, I remember it well. A goodly wench, and worthy all commendation. Her mother was more free and less particular, a troublesome and ugly-tempered beldame, but furnished with a wit above the common. We lost her through it. Her gift of palmistry and other sorts of fortune-telling begot for her at last a witch's name and fame. The law roasted her to death at a slow fire. It did touch me to a sort of tenderness to see the gallant way she met her lot, cursing and rivaling all the crowd that gaped and gazed around her, whilst the flames licked upward toward her face and catched her thin locks and crackled about her old gray head. Cursing them, said I? Cursing them! Why, an' thou wouldst live 1,000 years, thou'dst never hear so masterful a cursing. Alack, her art died with her. There be base and weakling imitations left, but no true blasphemy." The ruffler sighed, the listeners sighed in sympathy. A general depression fell upon the company for a moment, for even hardened outcasts like these are not wholly dead to sentiment, but are able to feel a fleeting sense of loss and affliction at wide intervals and under peculiarly favoring circumstances, as in cases like to this, for instance, when genius and culture depart and leave no heir. However, a deep drink all round soon restored the spirits of the mourners. "Have any others of our friends fared hardly?" asked Hobbs. "Some, yes, particularly newcomers, such as small husbandmen, turned shiftless and hungry upon the world because their farms were taken from them to be changed to sheep ranges. They begged and were whipped at the cart's tail, naked from the girdle up, till the blood ran, then set in the stocks to be pelted. They begged again, were whipped again, and deprived of an ear. They begged a third time, poor devils, what else could they do? And were branded on the cheek with a red-hot iron, then sold for slaves. They ran away, were hunted down, and hanged. 'Tis a brief tale, and quickly told. Others of us have fared less hardly. Stand forth, yokel, Burns, and Hodge. Show your adornments." These stood up and stripped away some of their rags, exposing their backs, criss-crossed with ropey old welts left by the lash. One turned up his hair and showed the place where a left ear had once been. Another showed a brand upon his shoulder, the letter V, and a mutilated ear. The third said, "I am yokel, once a farmer and prosperous, with loving wife and kids. Now am I somewhat different in estate and calling, and the wife and kids are gone. Mayhap they are in heaven, mayhap in the other place. But the kindly God be thanked, they bide no more in England. My good old blameless mother strove to earn bread by nursing the sick. One of these died, the doctors knew not how, so my mother was burnt for a witch, whilst my babes looked on and wailed English law. Up all with your cups, now all together and with a cheer. Drink to the merciful English law that delivered her from the English hell. Thank you, mates, one and all. I begged from house to house, I and the wife, bearing with us the hungry kids, but it was crime to be hungry in England, so they stripped us and lashed us through 3 towns. Drink ye all again to the merciful English law. For its lash drank deep of my Mary's blood, and its blessed deliverance came quick. She lies there in the potter's field, safe from all harms. And the kids, well, whilst the law lashed me from town to town, they starved. Drink, lads, only a drop to the poor kids, that never did any creature harm. I begged again, begged for a crust, and got the stocks and lost an ear. See, here bides the stump. I begged again, and here's the stump of the other to keep me minded of it. And still I begged again, and was sold for a slave. Here on my cheek under this stain, if I washed it off, ye might see the red S, the branding iron left there. A slave. Do ye understand that word? An English slave. That is he that stands before ye. I have run from my master, and when I am found, the heavy curse of heaven fall on the law and the land that hath commanded it, I shall hang."
[Footnote: Enslaving. So young a king and so ignorant a peasant were likely to make mistakes, and this is an instance in point. The peasant was suffering from this law by anticipation. The king was venting his indignation against a law which was not yet in existence. For this hideous statute was to have birth in this little king's own reign. However, we know from the humanity of his character that it could never have been suggested by him. End of footnote. A ringing voice came through the murky air.
"Thou shalt not! And this day the end of that law is come."
All turned and saw the fantastic figure of the little king approaching hurriedly. As it emerged into the light and was clearly revealed, a general explosion of inquiries broke out.
"Who is it? What is it? Who art thou, mannikin?"
The boy stood unconfused in the midst of all those surprised and questioning eyes, and answered with princely dignity,
"I am Edward, King of England."
A wild burst of laughter followed, partly of derision and partly of delight in the excellence of the joke. The king was stung. He said sharply,
"Ye mannerless vagrants, is this your recognition of the royal boon I have promised?"
He said more, with angry voice and excited gesture, but it was lost in a whirlwind of laughter and mocking exclamations. John Hobbs made several attempts to make himself heard above the din, and at last succeeded, saying,
"Mates, he is my son, a dreamer, a fool, and stark mad. Mind him not, he thinketh he is the king."
"I am the king," said Edward, turning toward him, "as thou shalt know to thy cost in good time. Thou hast confessed a murder. Thou shalt swing for it."
"Thou'lt betray me, thou, and I get my hands upon thee?"
"Tut, tut," said the burly Ruffler, interposing in time to save the king, and emphasizing this service by knocking Hobbs down with his fist.
"Hast respect for neither kings nor rufflers? An thou insult my presence so again, I'll hang thee up myself."
Then he said to his majesty,
"Thou must make no threats against thy mates, lad, and thou must guard thy tongue from saying evil of them elsewhere. Be king, if it please thy mad humour, but be not harmful in it. Sink the title thou hast uttered. 'Tis treason. We be bad men, in some few trifling ways, but none among us is so base as to be traitor to his king. We be loving and loyal hearts in that regard. Note if I speak truth. Now, all together, long live Edward, King of England!" "Long live Edward, King of England!"
The response came with such a thunder gust from the motley crew that the crazy building vibrated to the sound. The little king's face lighted with pleasure for an instant, and he slightly inclined his head and said with grave simplicity, "I thank you, my good people." This unexpected result threw the company into convulsions of merriment. When something like quiet was presently come again, the Ruffler said, firmly, but with an accent of good nature,
"Drop it, boy. 'Tis not wise nor well. Humour thy fancy if thou must, but choose some other title."
A tinker shrieked out a suggestion.
"Foo-foo the First, King of the Mooncalves!"
The title "took" at once. Every throat responded, and a roaring shout went up of
"Long live Foo-foo the First, King of the Mooncalves!"
followed by hootings, catcalls, and peals of laughter.
"Hail him forth and crown him! Robe him! Sceptre him! Throne him!"
These and 20 other cries broke out at once, and almost before the poor little victim could draw a breath, he was crowned with a tin basin, robed in a tattered blanket, throned upon a barrel, and sceptered with the tinker's soldering iron. Then all flung themselves upon their knees about him, and sent up a chorus of ironical wailings and mocking supplications, whilst they swabbed their eyes with their soiled and ragged sleeves and aprons.
"Be gracious to us, O sweet King! Trample not upon thy beseeching worms, O noble Majesty! Pity thy slaves, and comfort them with a royal kick! Cheer us and warm us with thy gracious rays, O flaming sun of sovereignty! Sanctify the ground with the touch of thy foot, that we may eat the dirt and be ennobled! Deign to spit upon us, O sire, that our children's children may tell of thy princely condescension, and be proud and happy forever!"
But the humorous tinker made the hit of the evening and carried off the honors. Kneeling, he pretended to kiss the king's foot, and was indignantly spurned. whereupon he went about begging for a rag to paste over the place upon his face which had been touched by the foot, saying it must be preserved from contact with the vulgar air, and that he should make his fortune by going on the highway and exposing it to view at the rate of 100 shillings a sight. He made himself so killingly funny that he was the envy and admiration of the whole mangy rabble. Tears of shame and indignation stood in the little monarch's eyes, and the thought in his heart was, "Had I offered them a deep wrong, they could not be more cruel. Yet have I proffered naught but to do them kindness, and it is thus they use me for it." End of chapter 17.